Hello, I'm Sandy Johnson, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation. We know reporters are focused on the presidential race and other candidates running for office on November 3rd, but election ballots also list scores of referendums and initiatives that hold the potential to impact millions of people. Some examples: bond measures, marijuana legalization, abortion restrictions, tax increases, minimum wage, affirmative action, policing reforms. These issues and more are on November 3rd ballots at the state and local level. Today, NPF offers reporters guidance on how to spot cross-state ballot initiatives, how to explain the often archaic and confusing ballot language in lay terms so voters can understand them, and how to follow the big money behind the issues. To help you, today we have with us three experts on ballot measures. John Matsusaka, Executive Director of the Initiative and Referendum Institute and a University of Southern California professor. Ryan Byrne, Team Lead for Ballot Measures at Ballotpedia. And Pete Quist, Research Director at the National Institute on Money and Politics. Again, my name is Sandy Johnson, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation and a veteran editor of elections going back to the 1980s. Welcome. So let's start with John. Can you tell us why it's important for reporters to report on ballot measures?
So this is a great way to start because those of us who work on ballot propositions, we sometimes feel a slight bit of frustration that there isn't more attention given to these propositions than there actually are. So why should you actually be covering these things? There's several reasons. The first one, and I think the main one, is that they're actually very important at an operational level to people's lives. Sandy, you went through a list of issues like minimum wage or marijuana legalization, and you can go on and on and on, tax increases, tax cuts that affect people's lives on an operational basis. And these are just as important to many people's day-to-day lives as the national races that get all the attention. I was actually curious about how important ballot propositions are, and I thought I might use money at one point. So I just a few months ago I calculated the amount of money that had been spent just in California on ballot propositions, because money's an indicator of how important something is, at least to some people. Over the last 20 years, I calculated that there had been $3.4 billion spent on ballot proposition campaigns in California. Again, that's $3.4 billion over the last 20 years. For those of you who do campaign finance, you know that's a pretty sizable number, but it's also sizable compared to the amount of money that was spent on the state legislature, the Assembly and Senate. During the same period, $1.4 billion was spent. So much more money was spent on ballot propositions. And if money is any indicator of where the people on the ground, what the people on the ground think is important, that's a really interesting indicator. The second reason, really important reason I think to cover these is that voters really need to have these ballot propositions covered. Unlike candidate elections, all elections are complicated because they have a bunch of different issues in play and there's complexities of issues and so forth. But for candidate election, voters can rely on partisan cues. They can see whether it's a Democrat or Republican, and that can point them in the direction of where their values and interests lie. For ballot propositions, there are no cues. There's just the text of a law. That presents the voters with a very much more complicated decision process. And I think that's where the media can really play a fundamentally important role of informing people. And not only that, on top of it all, we're seeing California is a particularly, unfortunately, distressing example this year, but we're seeing that the people that are charged to actually write the ballot descriptions, the official things that are written on the ballot, appear to be doing it in a somewhat deceptive way, at least according to the campaigns. So we're not even able to really trust the officials who are supposed to neutrally be doing this. So I would say that's the other really fundamentally important reason why this should be covered.
And Ryan, can you describe for us where ballot measures come from and how that varies from state to state?
Sure, yeah, there is a great variation in where ballot measures come from. So at the state level, there are two common origins of the state legislature and citizen-initiated petitions. There are a few other forms that I won't get into in too much detail, such as automatic ballot questions. In 2020, there's one in Iowa asking voters about holding a constitutional convention. In some states, there's also commissions that have the power to put measures directly on the ballot. Maybe the best example is the Florida Constitution Revision Commission. So In some, ballot measures can originate in legislatures with citizen-initiated petitions, with commissions, and some even go on the ballot automatically. But I'm going to focus primarily just on those two common types, ones that originate in legislatures and ones that originate with citizen-initiated petitions. So legislatures, 49 states require voter approval for a constitutional change to occur. That's state constitutions. You're probably wondering, 49 states, what's that one state that doesn't require this? That's Delaware. So the process of putting a legislatively referred measure on the ballot also varies state by state. There are two main factors. So how many sessions the legislature needs to approve the constitutional amendment or other type of referral before it goes on the ballot. That's usually 1 or 2. So you can think of it as being approved in 1 year or needing to approve it twice before it goes on the ballot. Also, the size of the vote, which can range from a simple majority of legislators to 2/3 of legislators. And there are even some statutes that require voter approval. So certain general obligation bonds, and in Arizona and California, any legislative proposals to change ballot initiatives that were previously approved by voters need to go back on the ballot, with some exceptions for details and things like that. Now, the ones that are probably covered the most are citizen-initiated measures. 26 states provide for some form of a ballot initiative. They can include statutes or constitutional amendments. There's also a third type, and I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting types of ballot measures, called a veto referendum. And you can think of this kind of like a governor's veto, except it's on the ballot box. People get a final say on a bill, often before it takes effect. And once again, the process of a citizen-initiated petition making the ballot is highly variable. Different states have different subject restrictions, different signature requirements, different signature distribution requirements. The timelines to collect signatures vary. So there's also the issue of whether an initiative is indirect or direct, and I won't get into the detail with that right now. But I think the biggest takeaway from all these different variations is that in the United States, direct democracy is largely a state issue. There aren't too many federal laws. There aren't really any federal laws that govern the process, though courts have interpreted parts of the US Constitution to configure signature requirements and things like that. So since it's a state issue, it's largely going to vary state by state. There isn't a uniform process across the country.
And go ahead, John.
Just to add one thing for those who don't cover these very much, just adding on to one thing that Ryan said. When you go into vote, there's a list of things that you vote on the ballot, and they come from different places. It's really important to know that about 60% of those, the majority of those in almost every state, are coming from the legislature. They're not citizen-initiated ones. The ones that are coming from the citizens are called typically initiatives, as Ryan said. Those are the ones that are the high-powered and the most controversial ones. But I think there's often a confusion sometimes when people discuss these about what they actually are. And I just want to emphasize the word initiative does not mean something on the ballot. The word initiative means something on the ballot that the citizens put on there themselves, not something that the legislator put on. And that's actually only about 30% of the things that are on there.
And what is a good shorthand resource for reporters? Because it varies so much from state to state. Is there like an election center or Secretary of State's office? Or is there a one-stop shop for reporters who are watching the webinar?
On Ballotpedia, we have a list of laws governing the ballot initiative process in each state. So if you're working on a particular state, you can go to Ballotpedia and search for laws governing the initiative process in whatever state, and we have a page on that. We also produce pages each election cycle that tell you the specific requirements across the states. So for example, in 2020, we'll have a list of states that which includes the signature deadlines and the number of signatures required.
I want to echo, if I can, Ballotpedia. I think that's really the go-to source. It's very up to date. It's very comprehensive. The NCSL also tracks some of these things. I think they're good. My institute, National Referendum Institute, puts out kind of reports, but they're overviewish types of things. But for current stuff, Ballotpedia is really where I would go.
Let's talk about what, from you guys are students and scholars of what's going on in ballot measure land. So why don't you each tell the audience the 2 or 3 ballot initiatives or measures that you think are important this year or interesting from your perspective. And let's start with Pete.
Sure. So we've seen quite a few issues that have cropped up over the years as issues of the day. I think one that's new that is showing up in a few different states this year is actually dealing with ranked choice voting and how people elect their representatives. We've got at least 4 states right now with ballot measures that have qualified for the ballot this fall dealing with that issue, which is more than we've had in any year of the past, including one in Maine to expand their ranked choice voting that they passed a couple of years ago. Other issues that have come up are things that we see pretty much every year, dealing with Marcy's Law or marijuana legalization, and that sort of item too. I will point out that our organization, the National Institute on Money and Politics, is focused very heavily on the money side here. It's pretty early, even though it doesn't feel like it, in the money game for ballot measures. We see about half of the money behind ballot measures as a group come in September and October. And so it's quite a big jump at the end. And in particular, in October, we see more than a quarter of the money typically come in. So,
now, this is very timely for reporters then.
Yes, it is. And across the country, you'll see about usually 3,500 campaign finance reports filed by ballot measure committees that we collect and compile for reporters.
Ryan, what are some of your favorites?
That's a good question. I was actually going to follow exactly what Pete said about the ranked choice voting measures. I think, they're voting in Alaska and Massachusetts on ranked choice voting. Alaska's is particularly interesting because it also involves a top 4 primary system. So you can think of, I think reporters will probably be mostly common, will think of like California's top 2 system. This would be top 4, kind of the same thing, but 4. And then they would run in the general election using ranked choice voting. Also, in California, both Proposition 16 and Proposition 22 are receiving a lot of attention, probably, mostly because of their national context, right? Proposition 16 deals with affirmative action policies that revolve around sex-based and race-based preferences. And 16 would actually repeal an old law, which made California the first state to enact a formal ban on those types of affirmative action. So within the context of a lot of conflict right now in the country around issues involving race, I think that one is pretty important this year. And 22 people might be pretty familiar with, which is connected to labor politics, big tech, rideshare, the gig economy. And that is a ballot measure that has received significant financial support from Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and it would exempt rideshare drivers from a recently passed California law that would very likely define them as employees, especially in light of some recent court rulings.
And John, what about your top choices?
I agree with the ones that had mentioned. I do think it's probably worth also noting that probably the most common issue that's on the ballots across the country this November is drug legalization, particularly marijuana. This has been an issue which has been growing since the 90s, since some groups initially started to push for legalization of marijuana for medical uses, moving gradually toward outright legalization. It's now really kind of a tidal wave going across the country. There's at least 10 state level marijuana measures, 2 others having to do with other controlled substances, and a number of city-based measures as well. And this agenda is really fascinating. Oregon has a couple of measures, one to essentially decriminalize hallucinogenic mushrooms, another to essentially decriminalize all drugs, cocaine, LSD, heroin, and so forth. You get a $100 fine, a slap on the wrist if you have them. So I think that's a big issue, because I do think there's something there that suggests there's something happening nationally on that by adding up the individual pieces. Other than those, I think the rideshare measure is hugely important. I think which is going on in California, which Ryan mentioned. I suspect we'll see a lot of money poured into that from both sides. We'll see a lot of discussion on that. I think that's an issue which resonates tremendously with people. Who doesn't travel and use Uber or Lyft at this point? And there's a threat by the companies that this will destroy the market, and if the law stands. So just to be clear, what that measure is essentially about is that the legislature passed a law changing the way that rideshare companies treat their employees. Basically, they couldn't be private contractors anymore, and that has a bunch of implications for labor law. The rideshare companies, Uber and Lyft, said they're not economically viable in that if that law goes through, and they said that we'll have to pull out of the state. The court put a stay on that until the election, but that's a very, very big issue, which I think is just at a very operational level will have a huge effect on a lot of people. Also, for the reasons that Ryan said, the civil rights measure in California is something that really ought to be looked at. A number of states amended their constitutions in the 1990s to say that their state governments were not allowed to discriminate against or for anyone on the basis of race. And that had a big effect on universities because it meant that universities, instead of looking at race as a category, had to start looking at, say socioeconomic status. They had to focus more on whether people were coming from a poor or a disadvantaged background. In the current climate, it'll be very interesting to see if voters want to walk that back now, because these passed in a number of states by very large majorities across the political spectrum. So I think that's good. Let me just add one more, because both those are California measures, and sometimes we pay too much attention to California. But there's actually an interesting amendment on the ballot in Illinois that the governor put on the ballot of Illinois, which is right now the state allows income taxes to be assessed at a flat rate. Everybody pays the same percentage of income. Most states, and the federal government, as we know, has a progressive income tax. So the governor put $50 million of his own cash into a campaign to change the Constitution to allow progressive taxation. There were rumors that opposition groups were going to put in $50 million or more against that. If they really do put in $100 million or more, that would be a phenomenal amount to put into a ballot proposition campaign. That would be a phenomenal amount even in California. It's been done before, but rarely. But for a state like Illinois, it'd be amazing. So if that plays out, that could be a really interesting one to watch as well.
That's very interesting. Governor Pritzker has a lot of money, I guess.
Yeah, and that also raises some interesting issues that I think people are concerned about, is the ability of very rich people to, in some sense, run campaigns and advocate for laws. Now, of course, the voters have the final say, so I think this can be overdone. The voters can say you can spend all the money you want, and I'm not gonna support your law. But it nevertheless does raise questions because it's so much money that only a very, very rich person could actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pete, why don't you go ahead, and then we've got a question.
Sure. I want to make a comment on the Pritzker piece because ballot measure money is usually overwhelmingly coming from non-individual funders, so PACs or unions or corporations and that sort of thing. And currently, so far with our data in 2020, J.B. Pritzker has single-handedly evened that out to some extent with his $50 million donation. But the overarching concept of this question is important too, in that we're seeing ballot measures that resemble each other in different states. So as you're reporting on your measures in your state, keep in mind that it is unlikely that that is the first time that measure has come up onto a ballot, and it is worth looking at other states and seeing what the trends are and who the players are going to be.
All right, we've got a question from Tiffany Stecker of Bloomberg.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I wrote this in the chat too. How reliable is polling on ballot initiatives compared to a candidate? And is it generally more difficult to get voters to vote yes than no, regardless of the issue? So
polling well before the election is kind of close to meaningless. If you go out far enough before the election, most people haven't heard of the issue. They don't really know. They're responding to a title. And the titles have often been chosen by the pro campaigns. And so you see positive support early on. It's well known and very clear empirical regularity that support declines over the course of the campaign. I calculated the number for about 200 propositions, and it falls by about 8% on average, but it can fall by even larger amounts. So the people who do surveys are very good at what they do. This isn't to disparage them, but I think it's important to recognize that early on, voters actually haven't formed an opinion yet, so they're responding more to a concept rather than to the details.
Ryan or Pete, anything to add?
I'll second that too, and that's largely why the money comes in so late, is because unlike a lot of candidate campaigns where the season really is all year or multiple years sometimes, this really is the kind of thing where voters make up their minds more or less at the last minute, sometimes while they're standing there in front of the ballot.
Right, and I think I would just echo that point. A lot of the resources on the opposition side, especially for citizen-initiated measures, come later in the election cycle, and when those resources are mobilized, people start to learn the opposition's perspective, which usually isn't as available earlier in the process.
Hey, Ryan, why don't you give us sort of a tour of ballot measures across the last decade and describe trends that you've seen, because reporters love to talk about trends.
Right. So I think the trends have to some degree already been mentioned. So in the 2010s, the big one that I think a lot of people are going to recognize is marijuana legalization, right? Starting in 2012 with Colorado and Washington, though you can probably move that date back to 2010 when California voted on it, but rejected it. And then 2014, it continues on the West Coast with Oregon and Alaska. 2016 comes up again in California. This time they pass it. Nevada, you see it expand to eastern states via the ballot, Maine and Massachusetts. 2018, first Midwestern state, Michigan. And in 2020, it's still around. There's a number of medical marijuana measures, but in terms of recreational, it's back on the ballot in Arizona after it was defeated in 2016. It's also on the ballot in New Jersey, interestingly, as a legislative referral. So that is not a citizen-initiated measure, but partially because there was not agreement over a legalization statute in the legislature. So enough legislators did come together and say, well, we'll leave the broad scope of it up to voters and put it on the ballot as more of an abstract constitutional amendment, and then we'll pass implementing legislation. Other states with initiatives with marijuana, Montana and South Dakota. Another big trend, minimum wage, 2014 to 2018, 10 measures across the country, all of them approved. This year, there's just one, the Florida Amendment 2. There's some notable differences with Florida Amendment 2 than previous ones. So first, this is $15, which I believe is higher than the previous ones. Florida requires a 60% supermajority vote, which of course is going to make it harder to pass. And the campaign is largely funded by a firm associated with one individual, John Morgan, who's a well-known lawyer and ballot initiative proponent in Florida. Other big trends that are a little bit more recent, Medicaid expansion. So a number of states did not expand Medicaid under Obamacare. And then starting in 2017 with Maine, citizen groups, nonprofits, things like that started filing ballot initiatives to essentially take this issue directly to voters. Just in 2020, we've already seen this in Oklahoma and Missouri, where both were approved. And it might sound like a lot of these trends are kind of left of center issues. And I think overall that might be a correct observation. So while there are still plenty of right of center issues on the ballot, we've definitely seen like progressive organizations kind of step up the ballot initiative game more in recent years. But that does not mean that there hasn't been conservative trends or like libertarian oriented trends. I mean, you can just look at California in the 1980s and 90s on social issues, or the tax revolt period in multiple states, which also kind of started in California with Proposition 13, same-sex marriage in the 2000s, and of course abortion, which is hard to pin down as a trend because post Roe v. Wade, it kind of never really went away. We constantly see ballot measures related to abortion. It's constantly ballot measures related to taxes and things like that, which can kind of go both ways in terms of more progressive ideas with taxes versus more like conservative or libertarian ideas with taxes.
We have a question that came in from Joyce Frieden from MedPage today about the health issues. So if she says she's particularly interested in healthcare issues, and can you talk about those that are on state ballots related to healthcare issues like abortion, health insurance, or other issues? Maybe you can point her towards some resources where she can find ballot issues related specifically to some that you mentioned and other healthcare issues.
Right, I'm gonna give you a link here. So go to ballotpedia.org/healthcare on the ballot. So that's healthcare on the ballot. And you can organize that by state and year, and it will show you all the ballot measures through the various years and across the states on issues related to healthcare. Mm-hmm. So in 2020 alone, I think, right, we have the Medicaid issues. California is dealing with an issue related to dialysis clinics. Maine earlier this year voted on religious and philosophical exemptions for vaccines, which was a really interesting conflict.
Okay, Pete, but John, I want to give you a crack at that question too. Why don't we go first with Pete?
Sure. So I'll share my screen briefly here, and what you'll see is just a quick display that allows you. This is our website at followthemoney.org, and we collect campaign finance behind these measures. If you go up to this menu item in the upper left and then tools, you can get into ballot measures. And this gives you a list of measures that you can break down by issue area or by year or by state. And so this is a good resource, for example, for looking at healthcare measures or abortion measures or et cetera. And then from this page as well, if you were to click on a measure, you can immediately get to the top committees and donors that are supporting and opposing each measure as well.
And John?
I think Ryan covered the issues. In some ways, the most significant issues were the Medicaid expansion issues, but those are done. Those were voted on earlier. I think there's actually aren't all that many health-related issues, directly health-related issues on November's ballots.
And let's see, we have another question from Tiffany Stecker of Bloomberg.
Okay, thanks for a second question. I wanted to see if any of you had looked into these citizenship requirement for voting initiative. There's, I think, 3 now in Colorado, Alabama, and Florida. Do you think that's going to be an interesting issue this season?
On our end, I'll say that these kinds of measures are kind of hit and miss as far as how much money they raise. They'll be interesting, of course, in the outcomes that we see in these states. The fundraising behind a measure like this that's really a divisive social issue will typically come largely from individuals who make relatively modest, or sometimes somebody with a large purse string will come in and make a sizable contribution. But for the most part, these kinds of measures will usually not raise a ton of money, although they are very interesting to watch.
Right. One of the interesting things here is that there is a 501c4 nonprofit backing the measures, specifically in Florida and Colorado. I think the Alabama one as well. The Alabama one was put on the ballot by the legislature versus Florida and Colorado put on the ballot through petitions. That organization is called Citizen Voters Inc. I don't know many details about it, but yeah, I think these could become an issue, maybe even a trend over the next couple years as kind of some of the debates around electoral policy come up. And these are very much like suffrage measures in a very technical sense. I mean, literally, who can vote? So it doesn't have practical implications in many states because most states don't allow non-citizens to vote. But in some circumstances, like San Francisco school board elections, non-citizens can vote, at least ones with kids in the school system, I think.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and talk about the language of ballot measures, since Ryan just mentioned the nonprofit backing a couple of these ballot initiatives, and it's called Citizen Voters Inc. I mean, who can argue with that? And who can even tell what that means? Is that right-leaning? Is it left-leaning? Is it just a good government group? How can reporters get to understand who's supporting or the language behind the initiatives, and how can they explain that to voters so that the voters get the information that they need? And John, I'm going to toss that one to you.
So to get the money, you can go to follow the money is a great way to figure out where the money is. It's probably worth noting that spending on ballot propositions is essentially unregulated. It's unlimited. It's been that way since the Supreme Court decision since the 1970s. So it's not a Citizens United thing. It's been for a long time unregulated. Unlimited amounts can be spent by any group. You typically have to disclose it, and many states do a pretty good job of getting reporting. I'm reasonably satisfied that most of the money is being captured, and you can trace it back. As far as figuring out what these issues are about, it is important to talk to people. But I think this is getting to one of the issues, which is really one of my central issues, which is helping the voters function as informed citizens when they go to the polls. Because because I think that's a real big function of the media, is just helping voters make. I'm nervous to say the right decision, because the right decision is very subjective. I don't know what the right decision is, but you want people to make decisions that's right for them, that's consonant with their values and what they think should happen. And I think it's really important to understand how voters think about these issues as you write about them. There aren't, as I said before, there aren't partisan cues, so voters can't just key off whether it's a Republican or a Democratic Party issue. Parties seldom make endorsements on these things, so the voters have to go through and figure them out. Some issues are pretty simple, and you can figure them out by just looking at the title or looking at the basic ballot description. I think most voters will find something like, should marijuana be legalized for recreational use? Most voters will find that pretty simple. There is, of course, some texture in how you legalize and how it's enforced, but by and large, that's simple. Other issues are much more complicated. And the really important thing to realize is that voters do not approach these as if they were lawyers. That is, they never go and read the text. And I'm sure, I mean, we all vote on these issues. I'm sure that we never go read the text. It would be incomprehensible to voters who tried to do this. You know, it's tiny print with strike through lines on it and so forth. That's not the way people vote. They don't try to understand it like lawyers. So what do? Well, what voters do is they want to know, they want something which is called an information queue. They want to know who's for this and who's against this. Because if they can understand pretty much who's for this and who's against it, they can pretty much map into whether they should be voting for or against the issue. And one example I like to give is if you're an environmentalist, suppose, and there's a proposition on the ballot which is called the forest protection measure. And you want to know, is that really going to protect forests, or is that something that the timber industry put on there as a backdoor way to actually cut down more trees? Well, if you read the law, it's going to be really hard for you to figure it out. What you do instead is you want to know, well, what's the Sierra Club say on this issue? Or perhaps what does the timber industry say? Because you might want to vote opposite to them on the issue. So I think the lesson for this, for people who report on this, is it's really important to find out who are the proponents and to tell the voters who's arguing for it, who's arguing against it, and why. So I just want to emphasize this because it's really important. The voters, of course, the voters want to know the factual information of what things do, but the way they actually make a lot of voting decisions is by reference to cues, or more conventionally, let's just call it endorsements or recommendations by people they trust. It's really important to put before them the information on who are the people that are endorsing or opposing it.
And Ryan, you mentioned some props, I think both in California, Proposition 16 and 22. Reporters can get a little complacent and simply refer to ballot measures by their numbers or by the shorthand nickname. And are there places for reporters to go to get language that they can use for their readers that describe these ballot measures in layman's terms?
Right, so a lot of states put out voter guides. The voter guides can be helpful. They are, written by various individuals or agencies, so their quality is going to vary across state in terms of how contextual and factual they are, their level of bias, things like that. At Ballotpedia, we do provide summaries of all the statewide ballot measures, so that's always a good place to go as well. You can go to Ballotpedia and search for 2020 ballot measures, and you'll find a full list. You can click on each individual one and see a summary for that ballot measure. We do consider a number of things that I think reporters should likewise consider when we're writing these descriptions, just to help your readers understand what's going on. So a big thing, and to help yourself, I'll tell you that. So first, how would this ballot measure change X, whatever X is? Like if readers cannot understand the status quo, then they're not going to understand what the ballot measure does. So you need to help get yourself and your readers from A to B. You need to know the information that's necessary to understand the measure's purpose and significance. Often that's contextual data or historical data. As John said, the conflict itself, who's involved in the conflict, what are the main points of contention, are often the clearest signals to readers in terms of understanding their own positions. On a more practical note, pay attention to how words are defined. That's one place where you may need to go to the ballot text and look it up. So words aren't always as intuitive as they seem on the ballot. I was just discussing with someone about the definition of small business in a particular measure. You hear small business, something comes to your mind. The measure itself might not define the term small business in a very intuitive way. So you don't necessarily want to repeat that to your readers because it might give them a false impression. Lastly, consider bias. So early in the process, as related to money, if you're trying to learn about a ballot measure, you're really only getting typically the supporter's point of view. So there is some need to go to the text itself and at least provide a thorough skimming. You're not going to get the full story till later on.
Peter John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing on, just build on one thing that Ryan said, is that Some measures are very simple. We've been talking about the California Civil Rights Measure. I think it's probably one sentence or two sentences. Some are very simple, but a typical one is going to be actually quite long. And what is often the case is that, to use a cliche, but the devil is often in the details. There's broad statements of aspirations, but when you dig down into it, the real action is somewhere down in the bottom. I think it would be difficult for many people other than real experts to really figure out, okay, what is this really going to do, and where does this really cut? I think this is another reason you really have to go to the opponents and the proponents and ask them what exactly do you think is the thing that bothers you most about this, or that you like about this, because that will help you in some sense flesh out where the real action is, because the title itself and the basic description are usually broad things that use words in ways that technically might not be the way it's actually being used. And there's a bunch of funny stuff that sometimes can happen in there.
And I'll add on the campaign finance piece, there are a couple of issues here that the disclosure issues that can help reporters with what we do, for example, with standardizing contributor names and showing you all the money that they've made, even if they've contributed multiple times. But looking at those donors is really important, as John mentioned, to see who's supporting and opposing each side of the issue. And the dark money angle here is just absolutely frustrating for me in some cases, because you'll see contributors to ballot measure campaigns that are 501c4 groups like Citizens Vote or something like that. And that is one of the paramount issues in transparency in elections in general, including in elections and ballot measures. And I'll try not to get on my soapbox too much about that, but it is something that we're happy to try to help you work through as you report.
Ryan, how can reporters determine what to watch this election cycle?
Right, that's a good question. It can be difficult, right? So at this point, we know what's on the ballot for the most part, which is incredibly helpful. There are still cases where things may be struck from the ballot by judges for various reasons. But as of now, the ballot is, for the most part, certified across the states. So some things to help you with figuring out what to watch earlier in the process is things that have been mentioned already, big money. So if a measure has a lot of money behind it, it's likely to make the ballot. It's likely to have an impact. Things also as a reporter, so you don't always know the money right away, right? States have different campaign finance deadlines. So this is kind of a trick I've learned, is go to the campaign's website. And this sounds kind of crude, but the quality of their website determines a lot about the money that they have and things like that. So campaign websites can indicate how serious an attempt is by their quality. Big names, we've mentioned that. So are things connected to big names? Recent one in California for 2022 is a veto referendum on this flavored tobacco ban. We don't really know who's behind it yet, but we know that the people who filed it are lawyers who are associated with a number of tobacco companies. So that indicates this is probably something I want to watch. This isn't just, some random attempt, because, we have to consider that through the election cycle, there's 860, this year 881, I believe, which is actually a little bit on the lower end. Usually it tops 1,000 citizen initiatives filed across the country, just at the state level. That's not local measures. Only 40 something have made the ballot. So it's very easy to get distracted when you see a topic that's bright and exciting and you're like, this is, I want to cover this. But in a lot of states, you can just file an initiative. There aren't too many barriers to doing that. In other states, you have to pay so much money to file it, like California. Which means you got to be a little more serious. That hasn't always been the case. A couple years ago, before they passed that law, I think they upped it from $200 to $2,000. You would get a lot more random subjects, things like banning shellfish. So so context, conflicts, websites, big names, those are all things to go to help you kind of think about the what's important early on. Currently, just think about context. Context is really helpful. What are the big conflicts right now, right? We have these Black Lives Matter protests that definitely influences what issues are more prominent on the ballot. We got criminal justice measures, California Prop 16 with things related to race. So context. National context, even if it's not specifically related to ballot measures, kind of influences the sea that ballot measures are located in and what's prominent. So very much connect national conflicts to these state level ballot measure conflicts.
Right. Peter, John, anything to add?
I think that's really good, and it is really worth reiterating that tracking the money is a little difficult before the election because of those reporting schedules. Also, in some states, those reports are filed on handwritten paper. We digitize all that for you, but it does take us a little bit of time.
I would just add that Sandy, can I just add one just very briefly? I think there's a bit of a challenge, and I'm sure actually reporters and editors are better at finding out what their readers want to know than I am. But I think there's a challenge. What people are going to be talking about almost inevitably will be the things that have the most money thrown into them, because it's going to be it's going to be advertisements all over, and people are going to want to know about the things where there's a lot of money. So that's going to tell you what people kind of want to know about. Unfortunately, those aren't necessarily the most important issues. There may be some under the radar issues where there's not a lot of money behind them that actually people ought to be thinking about and ought to be talking about. And I don't know the answer to how to find those out, because there's also some under the radar issues that are very tertiary and ought to be ignored as well. But I think it might be worth, I think it's for sure people are going to want to know about the issues that are being advertised and where money is going on. But I think it's probably worth keeping in mind that there might be some really important issues that fly below the radar, and it could be a public service to bring some of those up a little more to the surface where there isn't money actually driving them up from one of the proponents.
Really important point. We have a question from Bill Kelly from Nebraska Public Radio.
So the proponents on the campaign finance side of medical marijuana tend to overlap quite a bit with recreational marijuana. And I think that was more true a little bit earlier, especially because this was sort of seen as sort of a stepping stone. So you might see a group like Renormal come in and make some contributions there.
There's actually a fascinating history, which we don't have time to go into here, but there were several well-organized groups that started to promote medical marijuana initiatives in the 1990s. And it was very clear that they wanted to get full legalization eventually, but they had a very methodical belief that start to do medical marijuana, get people used to the idea, they'll conclude that it's not harmful, and that will lay the groundwork for full legalization at some point. And so, I mean, George Soros put some money into some of these things in the early days. There were some people with some pretty deep pockets who pushed this agenda, kind of a libertarian type agenda. And it's been actually extremely successul as we're seeing here. But there's an interesting link, I think, if somebody wanted to drill down into it. And that story is kind of known, but I'm not, maybe I might be unaware of it, but I don't think that story's really been told in its detail yet.
Another big player.
Story tip.
Yeah, another big player in that was Peter Lewis, the founder of Progressive Insurance, the late founder of Progressive Insurance.
Okay, John, I know you've done extensive research over time, and what does your research tell you about how voters make their decisions on ballot measures, and maybe when?
Yeah, so this goes back again to something I was alluding to earlier, is that we have in our mind a kind of a civic responsibility kind of data processing model of citizens, that they go in and they read the text of the law, and then they reason from that to the outcome. And what I tried to suggest before is that we have pretty good evidence that that's not the way people behave. People look, they don't have the technical ability to really read and understand the details, so they're looking for advice from other people. Sometimes people find that a bit troubling. They think that's a problem with this entire way of making public decisions. But I think if you really think about it, that's the way we make all kinds of decisions in life. When we're deciding whether to take a particular drug for some sort of ailment, a legal drug, I'm not talking about marijuana, but we have a heart condition or something, or cholesterol, we don't go read the medical studies. We take advice from an expert, our doctor. So I think if you look at when we go buy things, when we buy consumer products, we read reviews from other people. We don't actually do direct research on many things in life. We take endorsements from people. And frankly, so does the legislature. The legislatures in most states, or the Congress, or the president, they don't read the actual text of the laws as well. They're getting advice from people that they trust, advisors and subject matter experts. So I think voters do what every reasonable person does in a world where time is scarce and they don't have expertise. They're looking for experts that they trust. And so I think it's really, as I said before, I think that's really important as you're writing about things to really make sure that that's part of the story. It's not just about the substance of the matter, but it really is helping people find their way to advice and recommendations that they trust.
That reminds me of something that a lot of journalists, the technique that they use is to get like two experts on an issue, and this would be great for ballot measures, like pro on the ballot measure and con on the ballot measure, or yes and no. That's a good way for voters, I think, then to be able to, as you pointed out, contextualize, oh, I sympathize with that person, or I'm opposed to that person's viewpoint.
Right, exactly, and look at where the money's coming from, because that's another way to sort of tell who it might be benefiting and who might be hurting.
Okay, Pete, I'm going to turn to you and have you talk a little bit about how to track money behind ballot measures and some background on contributions from various committees.
Yeah, and so I'll go ahead and share my screen here again. So this is all publicly available and free for journalistic use. And from our homepage here at Follow the Money, we can do a search for contributions to ballot measures, and we can go as broad or as narrowly as you'd like. So if we wanted to do a search for contributions to every ballot measure committee across the last 20 years or so that we've been collecting this data, we could. By the way, that's about $7.3 billion. In this search, to demonstrate, I'm going to click on the Ask Anything, and I'm going to look at contributions to recent healthcare measures. And so we're going to do, this brings up a little pop-up, and this is something that we're happy to talk with you and work with you as journalists as you work on your stories to go through this interface, because it is rather complex, because it tries to answer any question you can come up with. And so here we're looking at contributions to ballot measures. And I'm going to look at ballot measures in specific years. And I'm just going to go ahead and grab a few years here. And then we'll do, and you'll see we're starting to build a sentence that says, show me contributions to ballot measure committees supporting or opposing measures in these years. And we're going to limit this to healthcare measures, so contributions to ballot measures related to the health industry. And with this, if I scroll down a little bit, I'll get to health issues. And then I'll just click go. And what this is doing now is pulling in all the contributions to committees that supported or opposed healthcare measures on statewide ballots in these election years. And we can even look at the sectors that are involved here. And so this is economic classifications that we assign to donors. And so you can see that this isn't too surprising. The health industry is the #1 sector making contributions to these measures. This means that there are 725 checks written, totaling $242 million. So this is pretty sizable stuff. And then if we want to dive into the health sector and see who these donors are, we can use this little magnifying lens here. That's opening up a new browser tab for me. And I'm limiting this now to just health contributions to those ballot measures. And we can take a look at who these donors are, for example. And there is a lot that we can look at here. Obviously, there are a lot of different options that we can use to display. Everything that I'm doing here is reflecting in my URL, the search that I'm running, every checkbox that I check on to make a table. I can look at the transaction level of data if I want to, although this table is going to get pretty wide because of all the fields that are available. But this URL is reflecting everything that I do, which is important because you can embed that in a story. And in addition to that, you can actually export this data. You sign up for an account on our website, which is free up here in the upper right, and you can export this data and play with it yourself too. And this is all freely available for journalists.
Thank you, Pete. And I'll just put in a plug for followthemoney.org. They have wonderful resources for reporters at federal level, state level, local level on lobbying as well as campaign issues.
And we're here to help. We actually answer the phone. So our phone number is on the bottom of any page on our site. So please do give us a call, and we're happy to help with these stories.
We have another question. Someone mentioned George Soros is underwriting a lot of ballot measures over the years. Are there any crusading billionaires this year that that you all can name? I know we talked about Governor Pritzker. Are there others that come to mind?
Sheldon Adelson has come in on some ballot measures in the past. I don't know if he will this year. Who else is? Again, it's pretty early because these contributions tend to come in pretty late, but I certainly expect we will see some. The largest donors, though, do really tend to be corporations that are working on issues such as the Grocery Manufacturers Association in Washington really came in big on a GMO labeling issue there. What you're really going to see with most of the money in most cases is that a corporation will come in on an issue that's directly impacting them with large checks.
John or Pete, or Ryan rather, you think of any?
So I think on that note, it's often the case, and Pete said this, that it's not just corporations, but there's often nonprofits, which are, you know, in the public mind, highly associated with certain wealthy individuals, and the money often comes through those nonprofits rather than through the individuals themselves. Though there are plenty of cases where they do come from the individuals themselves, but I think that's a big thing to note.
And I'm not aware yet of any individuals putting large amounts in, but many people have been involved in the past. Tom Steyer has funded a bunch of things in the past. There's many people, but as far as this particular cycle, I'm not aware of. What both Pete and I think Ryan have mentioned is that the largest contributing group are corporations and other business interests, trade groups, and so forth. Number two is there's actually a fair amount of money, although clearly not anywhere near as much as corporations, comes from unions, particularly public employee unions. And then there is a lot of money that comes from wealthy individuals, quite a lot. It's interesting enough, it's almost always on the pro side. That is, corporations, you'll often find their money coming in opposing measures. You will find wealthy individuals more promoting measures.
Great. Reporters are always looking for reliable resources to quote in their work, aside from the organizations that you all represent, and we will list those on the resource pages of the online resources that we publish after this webinar. But what other organizations can you recommend to reporters as they're covering ballot measures between now and November 3rd?
I'm not sure. I like Ballotpedia. I like Follow the Money. I mean, those are good. I mean, they're not. There's many other good things, but those would be starting points for me. Just for data tracking, NCSL also does some data tracking that's pretty good.
I'll add to those would be the three that I would list for ballot measures specifically, but there are some other groups that have supplemental information that can be helpful for context. So one of them is a group called Good Jobs First that maintains data sets of tax subsidies and state contracts, in addition to things like fines levied for environmental violations and that sort of thing. That is freely available to reporters as well. And so if you're seeing a measure that might be spawned by something that has happened in your state, and you see donors come in, you might see if there's some background there related to that kind of stuff.
Good Jobs First.
Good Jobs First.
Okay.
And then there's a group called Little Sis, which is this is a crowdsourced source, so you take that for that, but they are mapping out relationships between people and organizations, and so that can help to illustrate those if you're running into some dead ends.
Say that name again.
Little Sis. It's the opposite of Big Brother is how it pitches itself.
And Ryan?
So there aren't too many organizations covering ballot measures across the entire nation. Obviously, we are at Ballotpedia. I see that someone dropped into the chat, League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a great resource for state-by-state ballot measures. So if you know, League of Women Voters of California, the League of Women Voters of Maine, so on and so forth, they often provide pretty good summaries of ballot measures that typically do not have bias in them. So yeah, I would recommend that resource as well for your state. They do sometimes endorse ballot measures related to certain policy areas, so obviously take that into consideration.
Okay, guys, we're about to wrap this up. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that you didn't get a chance to wedge into the conversation?
I'll mention one more group too, just on reporting in elections broadly and also in ballot measures. For a lot of the legal ramifications or questions about legal practices and that sort of thing, the Campaign Legal Center is really responsive to reporters who are interested in understanding the legal parameters of elections.
Campaign Legal Center. Great. Again, our thanks to John Matsukaka, Executive Director of the Initiative and Referendum Institute and a University of Southern California professor. Ryan Byrne, team lead for ballot measures at Ballotpedia, and Pete Quist, research director at the National Institute on Money and Politics. Free resources from this webinar will be published for your use later at nationalpress.org. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.